Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 Self-Direction Virtual Conference Series. My name is Casey DeLuca, and I'm the Director of Membership and Conferences at Applied Self-Direction. Thank you for joining us today for our session, How Stories Can Influence Change, Making an Impact by Sharing Your Personal Journey with Self-Direction. I'm going to run through just a few quick housekeeping issues before we begin. You can submit your questions and comments at any time during the presentation by using the Q&A pod in the lower left-hand corner of the Adobe Room. If you experience any audio or technical issues during today's session, you can send us a message, again, by either using that Q&A pod, or you can also email us at info@appliedselfdirection.com. Just a warning, we have been experiencing some problems with the Adobe links this afternoon. So if you get kicked out, please try to join us back in, and we just all have our fingers crossed that technology is on our side today. For the presentation, we have 4 speakers. Andy Burness is the founder and president of Burness, a mission-driven global communications firm. Andy has a long history with our team and with Self-Direction dating back to the 1990s. For the past 3 years, Andy has taught a course on strategic communications at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Last fall, he adapted this course curriculum for us to focus specifically on strategic communications to support self-direction. Our 3 other panelists today all participated in Andy's course. Maggie Hoffman is the parent of a son who used to self-direct when living in a state that offered self-direction. June Malone handles communications for a community provider and is also the mother to an adult daughter with autism. And then we also have Valerie Patino, financial management services provider, working with self-direction programs. So at this point, I will turn things over to Andy to get us started.
Thanks, Casey. So I figured it might be most helpful to set up the next speakers and for you who are listening to get a very quick overview of what that course was and what I've taught at the Kennedy School. And this graphic is basically the summary of that. So what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes will come across as abstract a little bit more than I usually do. But the good news is you're going to have 3 people follow me who will bring this to life with their own experiences of actually putting this theory of change into practice. So let me walk you through this theory of change that has been the sort of bedrock of how I've done communications over the last many years, with a goal of having real impact on social policy. So if you look at the top, you start with research. So research is a proxy for other words, such as data or evidence or whatever as best we can tell is the truth, whatever we know the science to be. So let's say there's a study that comes out in the New England Journal of Medicine. Let's say there's a report that comes out of the Public Health Department that involves interviews with 50 or 100 people. Let's say that there is an analysis that's done, a technical analysis that's done on self-direction as opposed to other strategies for people's lives, for people with disabilities. But in any case, there's an academic quality to what we're talking about. So that's the baseline that we're starting with. We have some information, some knowledge here, but it's pretty arcane. It comes across as sort of scientific. It's not very digestible. It's produced by experts, probably for experts, for the sake of argument. So that's where we start. The next step is to take that data, that evidence, that research, and translate it. What does translation mean? It means to summarize it in a digestible form for the public. And how do you do that? Well, you take the complicated information and you do a summary of this thing. You do it in a page or less. You get rid of jargon. You do what is technically called an abstract, perhaps. something very digestible. So there's a 10-page study, and it's now going down to, 1 page, and it says, this study was conducted, and this analysis was done in a certain way, and here are the essential findings. And nowhere in there is there a discussion of p-values or statistical complications or data methodology that is at a PhD level. It's meant to be quite straightforward. So it's a summary. It could involve graphics. It could involve interactive graphics. You see every day sort of COVID maps of who's got COVID and who doesn't, and what's happening in your state or your country. That is a translation of scientific information. It could be anything that is a digestible piece of information that synthesizes the research that you as the consumer would say, oh, I get this. I don't need to read the New England Journal of Medicine article. I get what's being said. In fact, I could tell my neighbor about it. I don't need a PhD. After it's been translated, you then can go to the media and say to the relevant journalist who you're trying to reach, I have a story for you. And my story is basically the following summary that I think you need to know. It's actually very interesting. There was a data set of 1,000 people in the state of Ohio looking at people with disabilities and the quality of their lives, and essentially this is what they found. It's going to be released tomorrow or next week. And I've got a little press release for you, or I have something else to tell you about, or I could do a pitch on the phone, but I can't defend the p-value from the scientific research article, and I'm happy to send you the article because you probably want to read it, but what I can do is essentially tell you what's going on and refer you to the experts if I'm not the expert. And that is what leads to media coverage. I'm sure you'll hear some of that today. And I'm happy to take questions on any of this later on. With the media coverage, now that what you have to say has been validated, which is critical, because you might say that self-direction is a very important and creative and valuable life-saving intervention for certain people, but that's you, you're biased. I mean, why shouldn't you say that from where you sit? That's a good thing. We'll get to stories in a minute. You can be a storyteller. But what the media does is gives you this sort of outside validation that says this is a legitimate story, and y'all out there in the public ought to pay attention. And you know yourself, if you live in Kansas City and there's something in the Kansas City Star on Kansas City radio, you are more inclined to say, hey, I heard this today on the news, than if somebody took a bullhorn in the middle of the town square and said, hey, everybody, listen up, this is important. So that's what the media does, and it then puts you in a position to be an advocate, because you're not just there with a bullhorn. You've got the scientific study behind you, you've got the media coverage behind you, and you're saying, this is important, and you're sending a note to the state senator or to the regulator or to the foundation or to your private sector partner or to an FMS provider who you want to get involved. And you're saying, look, there's an article in the Kansas City Star that actually summarizes something that was in the New England Journal of Medicine for whatever it is, and we really ought to get going. We don't need to wait because it's already out there in the public. And I'm not just telling you this de novo. I'm not just making this up. This is something that has been in the public square because it got media coverage. It's hard to think of anything that you would say has been a social change development that didn't have some play in the media along the way. So you've gotten the media coverage, and you now can actually go do advocacy. You can call forums that you otherwise couldn't have called. You can now engage with a politician who otherwise wouldn't know why you want to talk about self-direction. To pick up the phone and call a politician, or to write a politician and say, I'd like to talk to you because I'm having this experience with my son or daughter, that might get you in the door. It might, because it's a compelling story. But if it's linked to something that's bigger than your own experience that becomes a policy matter, then you have more ammunition for doing that. So we can talk about what advocacy is, and you're going to hear about advocacy today. And then if all goes well with advocacy, you'll actually get the policy change you want. I always say that, from the time you begin your communication strategy to the end of your effort there, it's not likely that you're going to get all the changes you want in policy, though sometimes you will, but it is likely that you're going to impact the policy conversation that's happening and that you will impact how some changes are being made somewhere. If you go through this exercise, you can make a difference. If you don't check these boxes, I think it's highly unlikely you will. So underpinning this theory of change are a few things I want to talk about. One is your audience. Who's the audience you're after? And the more narrow the audience you're after, the better. So it isn't like everybody in the public has to know what self-direction is. It could be that there are 4 people in the state health department who need to really act on self-direction. They're the most important people who need to know. It could be that there are parents with children with disabilities in a particular area, a particular town, a county, that they need to know. It could be that the school system needs to know. Whoever your audience is, that's who you're speaking to, and you never lose sight of that. You're not trying to educate the world. The world is not necessarily interested in what you're interested in. But there are certain people who are, and we want to target them. And even if they're not interested, there are certain people who should be. But there aren't many. There aren't millions. So you need to target that. What are you targeting them with? You're targeting them with a message. And your message is a summary, a concise statement, which is another conversation to be effective as to what are the essential points you're trying to make. What is the essential takeaway that you're trying to tell them? Under the message, who's the messenger? Who is the best messenger to get to your audience? Sometimes it's the expert. Sometimes it's the person with disabilities. Sometimes it's the person running the nursing home. Sometimes it's the, the economist who has information. Sometimes it's a parent. Sometimes it's a teacher. Who's the messenger to which audience? And that's really critical. So if you're speaking to a politically conservative audience, you have a different messenger than if you're speaking to a more progressive audience. Don't know. It depends on the situation. But you should always ask that question. And the last thing I want to say is, so you got a lot of data here, and it's good that you've got information, but where's the humanity behind it? Where's your story? Where's your story? Who has the story to tell? So either you bring up somebody else who has a story to tell, who you identify as a person who can represent the change you're talking about, or you yourself speak of a story that is close to your heart that you can speak to with some emotion or at least some caring and some humanity. This is not the brain side of it. It's the heart side of it. So the data piece and a lot of what goes into the media stuff is sort of the information side, but the story is what's going to bring it to life, and the story is what's going to engage the people who you want to listen, whether it's the policymaker or otherwise. And the last thing is the story should always involve somebody from the community, whatever that community means. The story is not told by an outside observer who says, let me tell you about a child with disabilities. It's like, that's okay, but it could be told by a pediatrician who speaks about that child, or better yet, it's told by the child, or better yet, that's fine, it's told by the parent or the teacher, someone from the community. And I think that cuts across every demographic we're talking about. So if we're talking about race as a piece of this, for example, it's not the expert, whatever that means, who did the story that ran in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's somebody from that community who can speak to the experience. That adds credibility and also reality, to lived experience, which matters. So I've thrown a lot of content at you in the abstract. I'm going to turn to Maggie now to get us started with a real-life example of what she's done in Maine, and that'll get us going, and be happy to take questions on the other end. So I turn to you, Maggie.
Thanks, Andy. I attended Andy's class, grimly holding on to my belief that as a veteran parent advocate, strongly steeped in all things IDD self-direction, I could speak about the need for system change and the benefits of a care economy. Summary statement, my message tanked. Andy and his communication model validated the power of a personal story as primary illustration of policy recommendations. I was most inspired by a close focus on the audience I hope to influence, and I changed the tone of my messaging. Here is an example of a sentence before applying Andy's strategies. Quote, once again, Maine submitted its IDD HCBS waiver without electing to include self-directed services. This deprives the people who use services from living lives that all other Mainers enjoy, lives of choice within their neighborhoods, end quote. Exactly who understands that message, much less is moved to action. Here is my reworked story. Jake was always seen as the problem child. In school, he was hypersensitive and strong-willed, no matter how many therapies and different teachers were thrown at him. Jake had to go. By the time he got to high school, he had amassed so many diagnoses and school-assigned deficits that it was hard to find the boy under the mountain of jargon. Jake communicated his distress through challenging behavior, but those in charge never understood his meaning and were rigidly focused on modifying his behavior. Exhausted by all the wrong-headed attempts to change him, it made more sense to create the right environment for him. Jake's self-image has never wavered. He wants others to see him as the music fan and anime enthusiast he is. A musically inclined administrator and I arranged for Jake and his education aide to work at a local CD and record store after lunch. At one with the guys with dirty hair and black jeans, Jake was motivated to say hello to his coworkers and learn new skills through work. Socializing became easier because he could chat with coworkers about new albums, and his superior stocking skills made him the go-to guy. This period of growth and self-esteem ended abruptly when Jake graduated from school. Each adult disability program he visited insisted that Jake go along with their routines and group activities. Provider agencies threatened us that Jake would be expelled if he didn't fit in. Every person is unique. Disability services shouldn't be one size fits most. Then I learned about self-directed services, a new way for people with disabilities to receive support to live their lives. People choose what they want to do and who they want to be with. Jake received funding from New York State, and with help, we hired young people who were themselves musicians and artists to be Jake's staff. They tried almost 24 different volunteer jobs in social settings before we got the right fit for Jake at another multimedia store. Where Jake worked 6 hours a week. Self-directed services had the flexibility for us to find a way for Jake to feel good about being in the world. Jake and his staff went to his manager's music gigs where Jake was one of a group of coworkers who were fellow music fans. Then we left New York and we moved to Maine for his dad's work, and Jake had to wait a long time for disability services. We discovered a distressing truth. Maine doesn't offer self-direction. Jake was lonely and depressed and was plunged back to being the guy with the problems. You could spend your time saying no and controlling a person's life, or you can find a way to say yes. Every state needs to offer self-directed services. Jake's life only began when we accepted the man he is and use self-directed services to provide the fuel for him to enjoy a full life. Okay, I'll turn it over to June.
Thanks, Maggie. What an amazingly compelling story. Great reason for exploring self-direction and supporting it. And I'm going to talk about something very similar. I work with 3L Place. It's based in Somerville. We provide lifelong learning and support to individuals with developmental challenges. And virtually all of the money that folks get from the state to participate in 3L Place comes through a self-direction program that we evolved after years, literally years of negotiation with the state through a pilot education and training initiative. Our program is modular in nature. People select the services and the curriculum that they want and need. They choose that on their own time frame. So we're not a sort of a one-size-fits-all program, as Maggie said. We're a program where people say, I need this, this, and this, and then they purchase those services and that learning from 3L Place. The state of Massachusetts didn't really understand that. They didn't really get anything about what we were trying to do. So self-direction was a perfect fit for us. We love our families. One of them, who I think was hoping to join us today, he and his son wrote a piece for Applied Self-Direction about their experience in using self-direction. And I think that Casey's planning to paste a link to that into, there it is, into chat. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, because one of the wonderful things about that story is that it explains in a very compelling personal way what John Underwood gets out of self-direction and how the flexibility that self-direction offers allows his family to purchase the very specific services that his situation requires. I just want to say that I really believe that greater knowledge and understanding of self-direction will go a long way to assuage the problems that organizations like 3L Place have had with trying to, have the state officials understand what it is that we're trying to do, why it's important for us to empower our people to drive their own boat, to make their own choices. And it feels to us like greater knowledge about why self-direction works really is dependent on people understanding it through the personal perspective, like John's perspective or Maggie's perspective. So please tell your stories, make an impact, and do influence change. Thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it over to Valerie next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, June. It's so interesting to recognize this model and in learning it, how it fits with financial management services. Us as providers, we're really diligently aware of the details of the programs, the statutes, working with the state. But we also have the opportunity to see self-direction in action on a daily basis. We're hearing stories from families. We are connecting with them on a close level every day in making these services work. And for myself, in learning this theory of change model and how to apply it when serving self-directed participants, it's really paved the way in understanding just how effective and powerful the messages that we can create, how it can be in creating your elements of messaging. And when you truly, truly connect with the stories that you hear in self-direction, can impact big change. Research. FMSs are integral in providing research and data, that qualitative data that state agencies and advocacy agencies ask from us. And then also the quantitative data as well, and just providing it in a way that's understandable. The conversations that we're having with families, can really lead to that valuable information to impact the change. Translation, I know Andy touched a lot on this. Translating it into a way that you can understand. Avoiding that jargon. FMSs can get, there I go, FMSs, Financial Management Services, can get so into jargon that I think it's hard for us to avoid. So just being diligently aware of, okay, am I using an acronym right now? Actually, we have a fun poll that I saw just came up on jargon. If you could participate and let us know jargon that you're not aware of, and we'll see the results. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. So as you can see, this is a big reason why we should avoid jargon and make sure that we're avoiding those acronyms and just spelling things out. It helps us to speak more clearly and get our message across in a much more effective way. Utilizing the elements of messaging techniques, recognizing who your audience is, that was a big one for me. Just how they're receiving that message as well goes into the creation of the message. Making sure that I'm focusing on what the issue is and why is it urgent, and then making clear the call to action is so important when you're putting together a message. Media. So that was one thing that I had never really explored was, okay, how can I as an FMS provider connect with the media? What would my role be in that? And so this model has really opened my eyes to, what is newsworthy? Is my message surprising? Is it unexpected? Would it be intriguing to my neighbor? Is it linked to what's already in the news? So just being aware of that. And I'm looking forward to exploring that a little more. I have never done that before, so I'm learning. But this model and recognizing, that media can be such an influential, and it's a much needed step in that change of theory model. Advocacy. Thinking about networking strategies. I know in Minnesota, the state that my FMS is in, the Minnesota FMS providers do get together quite a lot, and we'll talk through things, and that networking really helps make our messages stronger when we're advocating or working with those advocacy agencies to go to legislation and say, hey, you know what, this isn't working, or we have questions on this, or can these agencies work together to make sure that services are flowing as good as they can. And then for me, the most important is the impacting policy change. Contacting your legislators, preparing your 5-minute elevator speech. I still have to do that, so if anybody at the end wants to work on that with me, that would be great. But just being authentic in conveying your message is everything. It really is. Connecting with the heart of the issue, listening to the stories, asking your participants more questions. A story that can be linked to your message, your advocacy can go so much farther than you can even imagine when you internalize it and you're really just being sincere and authentic. We're talking about people's lives and their independence, and as FMS providers, it's essential that we connect with that and advocate for that. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Andy.
Thanks, Maggie and June and Valerie. 3 really different perspectives. It's just really interesting hearing from you. So I was taking notes while you were speaking. Let me throw a question at each of you to get the conversation going, and then I'll turn it back to Casey for everybody else to ask questions. But Maggie, let me start with you since you went first. Let me try this out on you. How did you use Jake's story to advocate for change that would benefit not only Jake, but other children?
So a lot of the folks I met in my new state, both those creating the policy and those responding to the potential of self-direction, all maintained that self-direction was a light touch service for those who need very little support. And I actually felt I was drowning emotionally and knew that I wanted to use Jake's story to highlight that it actually can be for folks who just are so easily triggered by the world around them that they can't fit in even in so-called specialized congregate settings. In fact, he was the most triggered by that. And that everyone has the right to live a real life of contentment. And that's how I decided to use Jake's story to try and give people, they didn't even know what they didn't know, Andy. And so I wanted to use a story to help expand the horizons and possibilities. I hope I did that.
And so who were you able to talk to with that story who you wouldn't have spoken to before?
Actually, some of the very first naysayers, a lot of the moms and dads who had their adult children in congregate, more traditional 24/7 settings, who felt that I had been minimizing what disability meant or the supports that were needed, and only through hearing our actual story did they realize that we're all one of the same, and they were much more open to a new message of a different service model. I'm not sure that yet that I have made an impression on the policy makers. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah, well, you will, the way you're talking. Let me say that. You will. June, you've done communications work independent of precisely what you're talking about today. As a professional communicator in your life, what advice do you offer for advocates or groups like 3L Place that have limited budgets or limited time and might wonder how they can be successful with their advocacy given these constraints?
Media coverage is a really good place to start, and you don't need to buy media lists to do that. Maggie's story, as compelling as it is a great example. I was a newspaper city editor for 10 years, and if I had heard that story, I would have, assigned a feature story and put it on the front page of my Sunday newspaper. It's really good, compelling storytelling, and I feel like I want to just advise people that your best, thing to do is to tell your stories, to make it as personal as possible, to talk about the, impact of the decisions upon your individual client or person, family member, and let them speak for themselves if they can. If they can't, be their advocate.
So my experience of doing this is to do a little bit of research to identify which reporters seem interested in any of a range of issues that touch on this, right? It could be issues of people with disabilities, it could be the elderly, it could be COVID and challenges with that, whatever. Have you found, you were a reporter, now you're not a reporter, how can people access a reporter effectively to get that story?
Well, you need to remember that they want to be accessed because that's their job, telling stories, and they want to be in touch with their community. So look at their website and click on their byline. You'll probably get an email form to be able to email them, and almost always you'll get a response from folks. At least I have found that to be the case. But I just want to, say that your model that you began the session with is really important because it if you go through the steps that you've outlined, it answers all the potential questions before they arise. So you won't have to worry about, a reporter catching you flat-footed and not knowing what to say to them, because you've already done the homework and you know what the reasons are for what the policy changes that you are advocating.
Got it. Thanks. Valerie, last up for now. This question, FMS providers, I'm particularly glad you are presenting, representing a serious constituency here. FMS providers often are not family caregivers. They might or might not be, but certainly not assumed. How can FMS providers focused on finance, which is what that work is, bring humanity to their message when they're not necessarily the ones with the child at home or the sort of situation that Maggie's in?
That's a really great question, Andy. I think it's just always, connecting back to the mission, the vision, the values that your agency sets forth, and really connecting with the families, the participants that you're serving, asking those in-depth questions. What's working, what's not working? Tell me about this part of your budget. Connecting with them on a deeper level really allows you to know how services are going, and then be able to translate that into, what legislative changes do we need to advocate for? So I would say definitely asking those questions and intimately knowing, the budget and the families and the participants that you're serving, based on their wants and needs too. Some families prefer, having a more, financial relationship, but there are some who will get closer with us and share just how things are going. And like I said before, as FMS providers, we uniquely know those statutes, the policies, and everything that goes into the program, and we also get to see the self-direction every day as folks are applying it in their lives.
Let me ask a related question. Any thoughts on how you might partner with a family to introduce yourselves to a policymaker, a journalist, a funder, a different type of funder that's interested in policy change, where it's not just you or the caregiver, but the two of you together? Have you given thought to that?
The two of us together, meaning the policy advocate and the FMS, then meeting with the family?
The family and the FMS provider.
Reaching out to maybe a policy advocate. A change.
Sure, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure we've done this in the past. Nothing's come to me personally that I've worked on, but I think it would just find that right story that's compelling, and then together, seeing what that family desires, and then together reaching out, looking for avenues for advocacy and getting that story out there.
Right. And we heard today how that can happen. Good.
Yes.
Thanks. So thank you all a lot. And I'd love talking to the three of you for a long time. But I'm going to turn it over to Casey now, and it's your turn.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy and Maggie and June and Valerie. So I'm just going to pause for a second so folks can submit their questions. Again, you can use the Q&A pod in the lower left-hand corner of the Adobe room. You'll also see we have a poll up in the room. So as we were planning this session, we started talking about how helpful it would be to have a network of people who are advocating for self-direction. And so if you're interested in staying in touch with today's presenters as well as the session attendees, please indicate so on this poll, and we will share a contact list. So it will be sharing your name, your organization, and your email address with others. And so our thinking for this group is that it can be a sounding board if folks are struggling with their messaging or their audience, or just a way to share different advocacy successes in other states, and a place to go if you have any questions and you want to ask for advice. Okay, so some questions are starting to come in. The first one is for you, Maggie. If story is an effective tool for advocacy, what point were you trying to get across, and why did you think a story was the best vehicle?
Thanks so much. So the point that I was trying to get across is that instead of seeing a traditional segregated model as the best way to support folks with developmental disabilities, that just like all of us, people like my son, have intense, passionate interests, people and places where they're more comfortable and feel that they live lives of meaning, and that self-direction is how we get to that place. And I had tried being a policy expert because, in truth, I felt that 33 years of doing consumer-directed and then self-directed services for myself and with hundreds of other families throughout those years, I thought I was a great expert, and I was convincing nobody. And so I realized what I'm most expert at is my son and his path and my path, trying to help him get to where he wanted to go. And I finally feel that I'm making headway using a real-life story, warts and all.
That's wonderful, Maggie. Thank you. We got two questions that are kind of similar, so I am going to bring them both over at the same time. And I'm thinking maybe, June, if you could take a first shot at answering this, and then I'd also love for Andy to chime in, and Maggie and Valerie, feel free if you have anything else to add too. But it's, what's the best way to approach the media with a story suggestion? And then the similar question was, what are journalists looking for in a story pitch? Can I just call my local newspaper? How do I get the ball rolling?
So I would suggest that this seminar was a really great first place to get the ball rolling. If you do the process that Andy talked about at the very beginning of the seminar, you'll be prepared to call the media. What you don't want to do is call up and say, I think this is important. Can you do a story about it? What you want to make sure that you've done is your homework. So you want to give them something that's solid and believable and inspiring and achievable so that they understand that anything they write can, in fact, make a difference. Andy?
Yeah, I would say there are a lot of ways to be able to persuade a journalist about coverage, but I would say for purposes of this particular group, I think if you have an individual story that's compelling, June, you were saying that you would have covered Maggie's story, that an individual story that's compelling, that speaks to a larger social problem. So it's not an interesting story that's a one-off story. Like, that's pretty cool, so what does that have to do with anybody else? That sort of ends up in a different category of things, like, I don't even know what, morning talk show of something weird that happened to somebody one day. But we're talking about individual stories that people can really relate to. And the question is, why are you telling me this story? And the answer is, I'm telling you this story about this person because there is a greater community, there's a greater need out in the public of which this person reflects that need. So that's the most powerful. That's something a journalist is interested in because they're speaking of a social problem with one person representing not only the problem, but the solution to it, a feel-good outcome that has.
Can I give another example, Andy?
Yeah.
Can I give you another example? So
Absolutely.
actually, two quick examples. When it was at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a local TV station do an article. What I had basically pitched to them was, we have a group of people who, because a lot of them have autism, come at us with communications difficulties. So how do you teach a group of people who either talk too much, don't speak at all, have a lot of conversational difficulty? How do you work with them in an online environment? So we kind of posed that as the interesting question and answered it by talking about how 3L Place went about doing that. And they came in and they focused on one of our members and talked to his mom and spent time with him when he was in a session with us. And it was a lovely little piece that they ran a couple times during the day on their 2 evening news programs. We also were talking about one of our members who, when the pandemic started, the program that she was in basically just ceased functioning. And after about 3 weeks, they started running kind of canned programs. 3L Place has always been live. We missed no time at all when the pandemic started. We switched to a virtual platform and provided, very individualized, tailored live programming for our members. And her mom switched her entire life from this other program to 3L Place because we were able to provide her with the individualized services that she needed, and she needed to use self-direction to be able to fund that. So those are 2 examples of really how you can come up with stories that appeal to journalists because they're about how you can make a difference with self-direction in the lives of the people that you're trying to serve.
Yeah, I love how you said that, particularly the first story, which is you had a story to tell that was a bigger societal story of real interest, but you did it through a family, a particular family. That was great. Really, really interesting.
I find, Andy, that's almost always the way to get the attention of the media is to, tell them about one person and how it can make a difference.
Great, thank you both. This next question is for Valerie. Let me pull it over. When I think of self-direction advocacy, I think of someone sharing a story about themselves or a family member who self-directs. What does advocacy look like on the part of an FMS provider?
I think it definitely looks like not working in isolation, networking, getting out there, partnering with different advocacy agencies, really taking that story and those findings, different patterns that you're seeing of things that might not work, taking those really impactful stories to your network and going from there.
Great, thank you. Next question, I'm thinking, Andy, maybe you could kick us off with this one. Would you also suggest that states with self-direction use stories as a way to help inform people who might want to use self-direction about what it is and the roles and responsibilities involved?
The short answer is absolutely yes, but I don't want to let go of the data side of it. So they're not isolated stories about interesting people with particular circumstances. They're stories about people who reflect a larger population. So along the lines of what we were talking about what makes a story newsworthy, it's also what is relevant to a politician. So if you were ever to testify or sit down with a politician and talk about something, just a simple story is what's going to get them in. I'll tell you, I'm involved locally where I live as a volunteer helping people who are hungry in light of the pandemic. So I go volunteer someplace. And I talk to the politicians about this, about making sure that they can have, that people are being fed and we're doing what we need to do to get people basic food. In any case, I always start by talking about the fact that the first time I went to the food pantry and I was, getting ready to help out, cars were coming by for food with families, but the cars were like a mile out. As far as I could see, were cars. People and people and people and people. And that speaks much more passionately and much more persuasively to the issue than saying there are 27 people who didn't get lunch today, or there's a hunger problem in the county, or something else. It's not abstract. It's very real. Like, gee, the whole street's blocked out as far as you can see. You couldn't even take a turn on a road because all these people are in line. So that counts as a story, but my interest is not merely helping that individual who's first in line, but trying to get a message to policymakers that there are thousands of people behind them. So you don't need a complicated or even a heartfelt story from your own life, but you can speak to something that's very meaningful that anyone who listens would say, wow, I didn't know that, and you got my attention. So yes, with a story, but make sure that it speaks to something that can go to scale beyond that individual.
Great. Thank you, Andy. That was really helpful. Okay, our next question. It can be hard to succinctly explain self-direction to a novice. Any tips for helping to explain to people why they should care? And this one could really go to anyone in the panel. Is anyone jumping with a response?
Hi, it's June. Yeah, I have something I'd like to say about that. So you want to consider your audience for that one particularly. So as Andy said, if you're discussing it with a policy person, they're going to have a different view of it from your next door neighbor who knows your kid and understands why your kid might need more specialized services. The policy people are going to see things through a lens of, what will this mean to my budget? Almost always, what will this mean to my budget? And I know there are a lot of visionary policy people, and if I'm tarring anybody with the wrong brush, please forgive me for that. But it's been our experience that a lot of the policy people that we've talked to are really very concerned, and probably rightly so, about what's this going to mean if self-direction is widely adopted. Won't that mean that people get a lot more, are demanding a lot more from us, and how are we going to pay for all of that? So, you know, someone else can also talk about that, but I mean the basic what is self-direction is, you know, you have the right to choose the services that you want and pay for them with the same money that you would have received if you were placed in some kind of program by the state, right? Isn't that something that we can, you know, most people would get behind? And I would suggest that maybe Casey or one of the other self-direction people might want to jump in on this.
I'm just pausing first to see if there's other folks on the panel that would like to share.
I'm most interested in what our three colleagues have done on the ground.
So for Valerie, in your role as an FMS, have you had to explain self-direction to folks that aren't familiar with it, and do you have any tips?
Yes, all the time. You know, friends, family, Val, what do you do? So being able to effectively communicate exactly what these services are and what they can do to transform lives, and telling those stories, having a couple in my back pocket to pull out, and it's very surprising. A lot of people will say, "Wow, I had no idea that programs like that existed," or "I didn't know that that could have such an impact," or a lot of times people will say, "Oh my goodness, this would work for, you know, this person that I know or this family member." So it creates awareness, and just yeah, I do come across it quite a lot.
So this is Maggie. I'd like to just also add that self-direction seemed like such a heavy lift for a lot of families that in New York State, about half a dozen parents got together and shared little stories, little vignettes of how self-direction worked for each of our different young adult children at work, in the community, and for some folks actually living in an apartment in the community. And should anyone want to see sort of basic ways to describe self-direction, just look at newyorkselfd.org, Self-Direction, a Practical Guide for Families.
Maybe Casey could paste that into the Q&A.
Yes, yep, I definitely can. Okay, our next question, Andy, do you want to start with this? What makes a good elevator pitch? I know Valerie was talking during her presentation that she's still working on her elevator pitch, like a lot of us are, for self-direction. So do you have any tips?
Yeah, here's my best answer, my elevator pitch response to your elevator pitch question. I think an exercise that I do is to come up with an answer to a description of what you're talking about in 60 seconds. And then after you've got that down that feels good, that's compelling, that you could tell your neighbor, they'd say, this is really interesting, I get it. Then I would boil it down to 30 seconds. And I'd take what's necessary in the best of the 60 seconds down to 30 seconds. And when you've got that pretty good, when you feel like in 30 seconds, I pretty much can tell you what you need to know, I'd get it down to 15 seconds. 15 seconds is not nothing. 15 seconds is probably 3 or 4 sentences. So here's what you need to know about self-direction. I have a child, blah, 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 blah. Before self-direction, this was their circumstance. After self-direction, this is their circumstance. It's changed our lives. It changed my family, and it ought to be available to everybody in the state of Louisiana. That's I don't know how many seconds I took. So I think that's what you do when you think of an elevator pitch. An elevator pitch is not a 3-minute essay.
And
that's
then,
a long time.
And this is June. I want to just add to that. And then you want to field test it. You want to use it on your friends and your family and your neighbors and your boss, and just see whether they get out of it what you're hoping they'll get out of it.
Particularly not people who already know the topic.
Yeah, especially people who don't know the terms.
Right. That help, Casey?
That's wonderful. We also got a comment from one of the attendees. I think this came in, Maggie, when you were talking about sharing your story, but that PBS NewsHour actually came to her house to film on the subject of vaccine inequality for people with disabilities. So she shared that the PBS link with me. So I'm going to send that to everybody in the chat, and that'll be really interesting to check it out. So thank you very much for sharing that. Okay, it looks like we are almost out of time. Let me just try to squeeze in one more question real quick. Andy, maybe you can start this, and maybe June, I'm sure you have thoughts too. Any tips for getting an op-ed published?
Yeah, go on a blog, go on Google and say how to write an op-ed, because there are guidelines and expectations of an op-ed. If you write an op-ed properly and you check the boxes of what an editor wants in an op-ed, and you keep it to 700-ish words, and you make it interesting, and you have a good lead, and you're saying something different that hasn't been said, and you've got some sort of story to back it up, all the elements of an op-ed, honestly, simply send it to the relevant person on the editorial page or the email address you're supposed to send it to, and say, I'm submitting an op-ed about blah, blah, blah. Here's why it's important, in a sentence, not a book, in a sentence. And just send the op-ed. And if it checks those boxes, you got a good chance of getting it run. It's not, the key, I think the barrier is less the editor, unless it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times. It's just very, very, very competitive. But if you're writing for a local outlet, and you have something compelling to say and it's timely, it's related to something else in the news, then I think if you follow the guidelines of an op-ed piece, which is a longer conversation, you've got a reasonable chance of doing it. But it's not just it's not an essay. So I'd say that. Be yourself. Write the way you would normally talk.
I would have said the same thing that Andy said. Exactly.
Great. Well, I know we're out of time, but thank you all so much for sharing your different perspectives. It was really interesting to hear about how advocating for self-direction can look so different coming from different seats. So thank you all very much. And thank you all for hanging in with us during all the tech problems that we had today. So hope that you all will be able to make more of our sessions in this series. Have a great afternoon.